You think she understands Japanese? Jonathan Pierce said it just loud enough to be heard, just soft enough to pretend it was private. Laughter rolled across the rooftop like a polite wave, the kind that comes from men who have never been questioned. 40 stories above Manhattan, under gold pendant lights and a skyline worth $1 billion, deals were supposed to close tonight. $800 million on the table. Crystal glasses. Tailored suits. A string quartet playing something soft and forgettable. And behind Jonathan's chair stood Naomi Carter, a black waitress in a pressed black uniform, posture straight, eyes calm, refilling a glass of imported sake that cost more than her weekly rent. Jonathan didn't look at her when he switched to Japanese. She's decorative, he told his Tokyo investors with a smirk. Like the art on the wall. One of them chuckled. Another adjusted his cufflinks. Naomi's hand never shook. She poured with precision, exactly 2 inches from the rim, the way she'd been trained. Invisible. That's what they thought she was. Invisible at 26. Invisible with a linguistics degree framed in her mother's living room in Queens. Invisible after spending 3 years in Osaka on scholarship, mastering dialects most Americans couldn't even recognize. Jonathan continued, relaxed, confident, using a language like armor. No risk, he added in Japanese. She wouldn't understand a word. The skyline glittered beyond the glass railing. Helicopter lights blinked in the distance. Inside, the air shifted almost imperceptibly. Naomi placed the bottle down gently. Not a sound. She had learned long ago that power doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it waits. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, crossing one polished Italian shoe over the other, completely certain the room belonged to him. He was the billionaire. The headline. The man who acquired companies before breakfast and reshaped markets before dinner. People moved when he spoke. Except this time, someone didn't. Naomi stepped forward, her expression unreadable. The investors noticed first. A subtle change in gravity. Jonathan followed their gaze, mildly irritated. And then she spoke. Fluent. Precise. Tokyo standard with a hint of Kansai warmth. I understood every word, Mr. Pierce, she said evenly. Including the part where you called me decorative. The quartet faltered for half a beat. One investor slowly lowered his glass. Jonathan's smile didn't disappear. It fractured. For the first time that evening, he actually looked at her. Not through her. At her. And Naomi held his gaze without blinking. The skyline was still there. The money was still on the table. But something else had just shifted. And everyone in that room felt it. No one moved for 3 full seconds. And in rooms like this 3 seconds can feel like 3 miles. Jonathan Pierce cleared his throat softly, the practiced sound of a man accustomed to regaining control without raising his voice. He gave a small laugh, polished and controlled. That is impressive, he replied in English, as if the language itself could reset the balance. I did not realize we had such talent on staff tonight. The word staff landed heavier than he intended. Naomi did not retreat. She did not apologize. She did not smile to make the moment easier for him. She simply stood there with her shoulders relaxed and her chin level. One of the Japanese investors, Mr. Takahashi, leaned forward slightly, studying her with new interest. Your pronunciation, he said gently in Japanese, is excellent. Where did you study? Naomi answered him in the same language, smooth and steady. I lived in Osaka for 3 years. I completed my graduate research in cross-cultural business communication. The string quartet resumed, but softer now, uncertain. The skyline beyond the glass seemed farther away. Jonathan shifted in his seat. That is very admirable, he said, forcing warmth into his tone. Perhaps we can all appreciate the global spirit of this evening. He reached for his glass, but his hand paused when Mr. Takahashi spoke again, still addressing Naomi. If you understand our language, then you also understand the importance of respect and partnership. The words were calm, almost conversational, but they did not miss their target. Jonathan felt the temperature change, even though the rooftop heaters glowed steadily. Of course, he responded quickly. Respect is foundational to my company. Naomi finally turned her eyes back to him. Respect is not something you declare, she said quietly in English. It is something you practice, especially when you believe no one else can hear you. A few executives at nearby tables pretended not to listen, but no one truly looked away. Jonathan's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second before he relaxed it again. You misunderstand the tone of a private joke, he said. There was no harm intended. Naomi tilted her head slightly. Words reveal intention more clearly than apologies ever do. The investors exchanged subtle glances. They had come prepared to sign documents worth $800 million to expand distribution across Asia, to merge technology and capital in a handshake photographed against the Manhattan skyline. Now the conversation had shifted from profit margins to character. Mr. Takahashi folded his hands on the table. In our culture, he said carefully, how someone treats a server reflects how they will treat a partner. Silence followed, heavier than before. Jonathan had built companies from nothing. He had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions before his 40th birthday. He understood leverage, and for the first time that night, he recognized that it no longer sat comfortably in his chair. Naomi stepped back half a pace, not retreating but restoring the shape of the room. She lifted the sake bottle once more, offering a refill with the same composure she had carried all evening. Professional, precise, unshaken. Jonathan watched her, truly watched her now, as if recalculating something he had misjudged. The investors did not reach for their pens. Not yet. Instead, they waited, because in that moment the question was no longer whether the numbers made sense. The question was whether the man across from them did. Jonathan Pierce had spent his entire adult life believing that perception was everything. Markets moved on perception. Stock prices rose and fell on perception. Even reputations could be redesigned with the right headline and a well-timed interview. But this was different. This was not a camera he could charm or a journalist he could outmaneuver. This was a table of disciplined investors who valued precision over performance. He straightened in his chair, smoothing the cuff of his tailored navy suit, as if fabric could restore authority. Let us refocus, he said evenly. We are here to discuss innovation, not semantics. His voice was controlled, but the effort behind it showed. Naomi stood just behind Mr. Takahashi now, the sake bottle resting lightly against her palm. She had stepped back into her role, yet somehow she no longer blended into the background. The room had adjusted around her presence. Mr. Takahashi did not look away from Jonathan. Language is not semantics, he replied calmly. It is character. The words were simple, but they landed with the clarity of a signed contract. One of the younger executives on the Japanese side, a woman in a charcoal gray suit, opened a leather portfolio and glanced at a printed report. Mr. Pierce, she said in measured English, your company has struggled to gain traction in Tokyo over the past 18 months. You attributed that to cultural misunderstanding. She paused briefly. Perhaps that explanation requires reconsideration. Jonathan felt the air narrow. He had indeed blamed market resistance on translation gaps and branding misalignment. It had been a convenient narrative. He glanced toward Naomi before he could stop himself. She met his eyes without challenge, without triumph. Just steady awareness. I employ an entire international strategy team, Jonathan said. We value cultural expertise. Then why, Mr. Takahashi asked gently, would the leader of that team assume someone serving him cannot understand him? The string quartet had faded into near silence again, sensing the shift. Beyond the glass railing, the Hudson River reflected scattered city lights like fractured silver. Naomi inhaled slowly. She had not intended to become the axis of an $800 million negotiation. She had come to work a double shift, to cover a colleague who was sick, to collect tips that would help cover her student loan payment due next week. Yet here she stood, not as a symbol, not as a headline, but as a reminder. Jonathan exhaled through his nose, recalculating. He was not a man unfamiliar with recovery. He had navigated product failures, public criticism, and aggressive competitors. But those battles had been fought with data and leverage. This one required something else. If my words suggested disrespect, he said carefully, then that is a failure on my part. It was not my intention to diminish anyone. Naomi finally spoke again, her tone calm, almost reflective. Intention does not erase impact, she said, especially when power is uneven. A subtle murmur moved through the investors, not of outrage but of recognition. Jonathan studied her, this time not as an employee, not as an interruption, but as an equal in the conversation. You studied cross-cultural business communication, correct? He asked. Yes, she replied. Then tell me, he said, what would you advise in this moment? It was not sarcasm. It was not performance. It was a question. Naomi set the sake bottle down gently on the table. I would advise listening more than speaking, she said. I would advise assuming competence instead of ignorance. And I would advise remembering that the smallest interaction often reveals the largest truth. Silence followed, but it felt different now. Less tense, more evaluative. Mr. Takahashi nodded slightly. That is sound advice. Jonathan looked at the unsigned documents in front of him. For the first time that evening, he understood that the negotiation had never been only about market expansion. It had been about trust. And trust, once questioned, required more than numbers to restore. The skyline shimmered beyond the glass, indifferent to pride and status. Inside, the most powerful man in the room realized that power without humility was simply noise. And across from him stood a waitress who had just shifted the balance of an $800 million decision without raising her voice even once. The rooftop felt smaller now, as if the skyline itself had leaned in to witness what would happen next. Jonathan Pierce did not reach for the contract. He did not signal for his legal team. Instead, he folded his hands on the table, mirroring the posture of the investors across from him. It was a subtle shift, but in rooms like this, posture speaks before words do. You are right, he said at last, his voice steady but stripped of its earlier polish. Leadership is tested in moments no one expects. I misjudged this one. The admission did not boom. It did not echo. It simply existed, clear and unguarded. Naomi watched him carefully, searching for performance. She had seen apologies shaped like strategy before. This one felt different. Not perfect, not heroic, just honest. Mr. Takahashi nodded once, slow and deliberate. Growth begins with recognition, he said. The younger executive closed her portfolio halfway, not fully committing, not fully withdrawing. The deal still hovered between them like a question waiting to be answered. Naomi sensed her role in this conversation was complete. She reached for the sake bottle again, offering refills with the same measured composure she had shown all evening. The action was simple, almost ordinary, yet it carried weight. She was not reclaiming power through dominance. She was reclaiming it through dignity. Jonathan looked at her once more. You mentioned assuming competence instead of ignorance, he said quietly. That applies to markets as well, does it not? Naomi met his gaze. It applies to people first, she replied. Markets follow people. A faint smile touched the corner of Mr. Takahashi's mouth. That is a perspective our expansion team would value, he said thoughtfully. Jonathan exhaled, a decision forming. Miss Carter, he began, choosing his words carefully. If you are willing, I would appreciate the opportunity to hear more of your insights after your shift. Not as staff. As a consultant. The words settled differently than the ones he had used earlier. Naomi did not rush to answer. The skyline shimmered behind her, city lights reflecting against the glass like quiet applause. She thought of her student loans, of her mother working late shifts at a hospital in Queens, of the years she spent mastering a language because she believed understanding bridged more than profit margins. I would consider that conversation, she said evenly, provided it is based on mutual respect. Jonathan nodded. Agreed. Across the table, Mr. Takahashi slowly opened the contract again. Trust is rebuilt through action, he said. Let tonight be the first of many. Pens were lifted. Signatures placed with deliberate strokes. The $800 million partnership did not close because pride won. It closed because humility entered the room. The quartet resumed with confidence this time, notes rising warm and certain into the Manhattan night. Naomi stepped back once more into the rhythm of her work, but she no longer felt invisible. Jonathan watched her for a brief moment before turning back to the documents. He had walked into the evening believing power meant control. He now understood it also meant accountability. And somewhere between the skyline and the signed pages, a billionaire learned that the most expensive lesson of the night was not written in numbers, but in the quiet strength of a woman he had once overlooked. The signatures dried under the soft glow of rooftop lights, ink settling into paper that would move markets by morning. Conversations resumed, lighter now, almost relieved, but the shift in energy remained. Jonathan Pierce stood as the investors gathered their folders, offering firm handshakes and measured smiles. When the final pleasantries were exchanged and the elevator doors closed behind the delegation from Tokyo, the rooftop grew quieter, the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass like a reminder that ambition never sleeps. Naomi collected empty glasses with the same steady rhythm she had carried all night, though something inside her had changed. Not pride. Not triumph. Just clarity. Jonathan approached her without an entourage this time. No legal team. No assistants. Just a man adjusting his understanding of himself. Miss Carter, he said, his tone direct but no longer elevated. I meant what I said earlier. I would value a formal conversation about expanding into Japan. You identified a blind spot in less than 2 minutes. That is rare. Naomi set a glass onto her tray and faced him fully. Insight is not rare, she replied. Listening is. Jonathan absorbed that without defense. I built my company on speed, he said after a moment. Move fast. Acquire faster. But speed without awareness creates distance. Tonight made that clear. Naomi studied him carefully. She had seen confidence before. She had seen arrogance dressed as leadership. What she saw now was something more unsettled and more real. Expansion into Japan will not depend only on translation, she said. It will depend on humility, local partnerships, cultural fluency that goes deeper than marketing campaigns. People want to be understood, not absorbed. Jonathan nodded slowly. That is precisely the perspective we have been missing. The wind lifted slightly across the rooftop, carrying the faint hum of traffic from 40 stories below. For years, Jonathan had measured success in acquisitions and quarterly growth. Tonight, he measured it in a single corrected assumption. What are your plans beyond this restaurant? He asked, not casually, but with intention. Naomi did not hesitate. I am completing my certification in international corporate mediation. I want to help companies avoid the kind of missteps that create distrust before the first contract is even signed. Jonathan allowed a small, genuine smile. Then perhaps tonight was not an interruption. Perhaps it was alignment. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed a business card, heavy stock, embossed lettering. He placed it gently on the edge of her tray instead of pressing it into her hand. My direct line is on the back, he said. If you choose to accept, I would like to retain you as a cultural strategy consultant. Not symbolic. Substantive. Naomi glanced at the card but did not pick it up immediately. Respect will determine whether I call, she said calmly. Jonathan inclined his head. Understood. A manager signaled discreetly from across the rooftop that closing procedures were beginning. Naomi resumed, gathering the final glasses. Jonathan watched her for a moment longer, then stepped back, giving space instead of claiming it. The skyline shimmered, steady and indifferent, yet. Something fundamental had shifted within the glass walls of that restaurant. A billionaire had entered the evening believing language could shield him. He was leaving it knowing language had exposed him. And a waitress who once seemed invisible had become the quiet architect of an $800 million turning point. Not because she raised her voice, but because she refused to lower her worth. The rooftop emptied slowly, the way powerful rooms always do after something unplanned happens. Staff folded white linens. Glassware disappeared into trays. The string quartet packed their instruments into black velvet cases. Manhattan still pulsed beyond the glass, yellow cabs threading through traffic like arteries of light. Naomi stepped into the service hallway, the heavy door closing softly behind her, muting the skyline into a distant glow. For a moment she leaned against the cool wall and exhaled. Not from fear, not from relief, from awareness. The night had shifted something permanent. She removed her apron carefully, folding it with precision before placing it in her locker. Jonathan Pierce's card rested in her palm now, heavier than it looked. Direct line. Personal email. No assistant filter. She turned it over once, then slipped it into her bag without ceremony. Outside the staff entrance, the air felt different from the controlled climate of the rooftop. It carried the scent of street food, gasoline, late-night ambition. 40 stories above, contracts had been signed. Down here, real life moved at sidewalk level. Naomi began the short walk toward the subway, heels tapping steadily against concrete. She replayed the evening in her mind, not the insult, but the moment of recalibration. The exact second Jonathan's posture changed. The subtle lowering of his voice. The recognition that power had limits when confronted by dignity. Her phone vibrated inside her bag. A notification from a financial news alert flashed across the screen. Pierce Global announces major expansion into Japan following strategic partnership. The headline had already been written. The narrative polished. The markets would open tomorrow and celebrate vision and growth. They would never mention the waitress who altered the tone of the room. And that was fine. Naomi did not need the headline. She needed impact. Meanwhile, back on the rooftop, Jonathan remained a few minutes longer than necessary. His executive team hovered at a respectful distance. One of them spoke cautiously. "Sir," the investors seemed satisfied. "We should prepare the press release for the morning cycle." Jonathan nodded, but his focus lingered elsewhere. "Schedule a cultural advisory review before the Tokyo rollout," he said. "And I want Miss Carter included in the preliminary discussion if she agrees." His team exchanged brief glances, surprised but compliant. "Understood." Jonathan looked once more at the empty chair Naomi had stood beside. He had built an empire by assuming speed equaled strength. Tonight had exposed a different equation. Awareness equaled endurance. He finally stepped into the elevator, descending toward a city that no longer felt entirely predictable. On the subway platform, Naomi stood among commuters in worn sneakers and business coats, people checking schedules, adjusting backpacks, living stories far from rooftop negotiations. The train roared into the station with a rush of wind. She stepped inside, gripping the overhead rail as the car lurched forward. In the reflection of the darkened window, she saw herself clearly. Not invisible, not decorative, prepared. The skyline receded behind her, but the shift it witnessed would travel much farther than those 40 stories. By morning, the world would celebrate a billionaire's expansion strategy. Only a handful would understand that the most important correction of the night had nothing to do with currency exchange or quarterly projections. It had everything to do with a single assumption, spoken too confidently, and a woman who refused to let it define her. And somewhere between Wall Street and Queens, a new partnership had quietly begun, not written in headlines, but in earned respect. Morning arrived without ceremony. Just pale sunlight slipping between buildings in Queens and the distant hum of traffic beginning again. Naomi sat at her small kitchen table, a ceramic mug warming her hands, the business card resting beside her phone like a quiet decision waiting to be made. The apartment was modest but orderly, textbooks stacked neatly near the window, a laptop open to a half-finished research draft on cross-cultural negotiation failures. Outside, a delivery truck rattled past. Inside, everything felt still. She replayed the night once more, not to relive the insult, but to analyze the shift. The exact moment humility entered the conversation. She had spent years studying how international partnerships collapse, how ego can cost more than currency fluctuations, how tone can unravel contracts before legal teams even notice. Last night had been a live case study 40 stories above Manhattan. Her phone buzzed again. Another financial headline. Pierce Global shares rise 3% after Tokyo deal. The market rewarded confidence. It rarely measured character. Naomi looked at the card again. Direct line. No assistant. That detail mattered. It suggested openness rather than optics. Across the East River, in a glass tower that reflected the morning sun like polished steel, Jonathan Pierce stood in his office reviewing projections for the Tokyo launch. His executive team moved quickly around him, energized by the positive press cycle. Yet his focus drifted to a different calculation. He had replayed the conversation in his own mind during the drive home, not defensively, but analytically. Leadership is tested in moments no one expects. He had said that. Now he felt the weight of it. He turned to his chief strategy officer. Schedule a cultural integration audit before any public announcement in Japan, he instructed. And I want external review, not internal affirmation. The officer nodded, surprised but compliant. Jonathan then glanced at his phone, hesitated for only a second, and sent a brief message to the number he had written on the back of his own card before leaving the rooftop. Thank you for the correction last night. If you are open to discussion, I would value your perspective. Naomi's phone lit up on the kitchen table. She read the message slowly, twice, measuring tone the way she had been trained to do. No embellishment. No defensiveness. No attempt to minimize. She set her mug down and typed carefully. I am available this afternoon after 3. Conversation only. Expectations will depend on respect and structure. She pressed send and felt something subtle settle inside her. Not excitement. Alignment. Jonathan read her reply during a board briefing and paused briefly before responding. Understood. 3:30 at our Midtown office. I will meet you personally. The board members continued discussing logistics, unaware that the most significant strategic adjustment of the quarter was not listed on any slide. That afternoon, The city moved with its usual urgency. Taxis merged. Pedestrians crossed against the light. Screens refreshed with market updates. But beneath the noise, something quieter was unfolding. A billionaire prepared to listen more than he spoke. A waitress prepared to advise rather than serve. Neither of them framed it as destiny. It was simply accountability meeting preparation at the right intersection. And somewhere between Queens and Midtown, between subway platforms and executive elevators, a new dynamic began to take shape. Not built on hierarchy, not built on assumption, built on the recognition that the strongest partnerships are not forged by dominance, but by the courage to be corrected. At 3:30 sharp, Naomi stepped out of the Midtown elevator into a lobby of polished marble and quiet power. The Pierce Global logo stretched across the far wall in brushed steel, reflecting the afternoon light like a statement carved into the future. She wore a tailored navy blazer over a simple white blouse, her posture composed, her expression steady. No apron, no tray. The receptionist glanced up, offered a professional smile, and said, "Mr. Pierce is expecting you." That sentence alone carried weight. Upstairs, Jonathan stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, the city unfolding beneath him in grids of ambition and motion. He had dismissed his assistants for the next hour. No interruptions. No observers. When Naomi entered, he walked forward to greet her, extending his hand without hesitation. "Thank you for coming," he said, not as a formality, but as acknowledgement. Naomi shook his hand firmly. "Thank you for the invitation." The office was spacious but restrained, glass walls, a long conference table, screens displaying global market data. Yet the atmosphere felt different from the rooftop the night before. Less theatrical, more deliberate. Jonathan gestured toward a seat at the table rather than positioning himself behind his desk. That detail did not go unnoticed. "I would like this to be a working conversation," he said. "Not symbolic." Naomi nodded once. "Then let us begin with the assumption that optics are not strategy." Jonathan allowed a small smile. "Agreed." He tapped the control on the table, and a projection appeared on the screen, outlining Pierce Global's expansion plan for Tokyo. Distribution channels, brand positioning, marketing partnerships. Naomi listened without interrupting, her eyes scanning each slide with trained focus. When the presentation ended, silence settled between them, but it was analytical, not tense. "Where would you begin?" Jonathan asked. Naomi folded her hands lightly on the table. "I would begin by removing the word expansion from your internal vocabulary," she said calmly. Jonathan raised an eyebrow slightly, intrigued rather than defensive. "Continue." "Japan does not respond well to expansion framed as acquisition," she explained. "It responds to integration framed as collaboration. Your messaging emphasizes market penetration. That language signals dominance. Replace it with partnership language rooted in shared innovation." Jonathan leaned back slightly, absorbing her words. "That is a subtle distinction." "It is not subtle to the audience receiving it," Naomi replied. "Culture is not a decorative layer on strategy. It is the foundation beneath it." Jonathan nodded slowly. "And what of leadership presence?" he asked. "You are the face of the company. Then your presence must communicate humility before ambition," she said. "In Japan, credibility grows through restraint. Listening sessions with local engineers. Public acknowledgement of what your company can learn, not only what it can offer." Jonathan exhaled thoughtfully. "That is not the narrative I have traditionally led with." "That is why it will be effective," Naomi responded. Silence followed again, but this time it felt constructive. Jonathan studied her across the table. "You have given this considerable thought." "I have spent years studying how multinational deals fail because leaders underestimate tone," she said. "Last night was simply a compressed example." Jonathan did not look away. "Then let us not underestimate it again." He closed the projection screen and extended his hand once more, not to conclude, but to formalize. "I would like to retain you as a cultural strategy consultant for our Tokyo initiative, effective immediately, subject to your terms." Naomi met his gaze steadily. "My first term is simple," she said. "Respect is not situational." Jonathan nodded without hesitation. "Understood." And in that quiet midtown office, far from the rooftop where assumptions once echoed, a new chapter began not with applause, but with alignment. The contract was finalized within 48 hours, but the real transformation unfolded in the weeks that followed. Naomi's name did not appear in press releases, yet her influence threaded quietly through every decision. In conference rooms overlooking Manhattan, she led listening sessions with senior executives who had once equated global presence with dominance. She asked questions that slowed conversations down. What assumptions are we making about their priorities? What have we not taken the time to understand? The answers were rarely comfortable, but they were necessary. Jonathan watched the shift with focused attention. He had always believed efficiency was measured in speed. Now he began measuring it in depth. During the first strategy call with the Tokyo team, he opened differently than he ever had before. Instead of outlining objectives, he asked for perspective. Instead of presenting forecasts, he requested feedback. Naomi sat beside him at the long glass table, not as background, not as an accessory, but as a strategist whose insight shaped tone before numbers entered the room. The Tokyo executives responded in kind. Conversations that might have felt transactional became collaborative. Where Pierce Global once emphasized acquisition targets, it now highlighted shared research initiatives and local leadership development. Within 3 months, early market data reflected something analysts struggled to quantify: trust. Brand perception in Tokyo rose steadily, not because of aggressive advertising, but because of consistent humility. Financial publications credited Jonathan's adaptive leadership. Investors praised his strategic recalibration. Only a handful understood that the recalibration began with a correction spoken calmly on a rooftop. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the Midtown office windows, Jonathan paused during a meeting and glanced toward Naomi. "You changed more than our messaging," he said plainly once the room had cleared. "You changed how I measure influence." Naomi considered that carefully. "Influence without respect is fragile," she replied. "It collapses the moment it is challenged." Jonathan nodded. "I spent years believing control was strength. It turns out awareness is stronger." Naomi allowed a small smile. "Awareness requires humility. Humility requires listening." The exchange was simple, but it carried the weight of everything that had shifted since that night. Later, as Naomi stepped out of the building onto the busy Manhattan sidewalk, she looked up at the glass tower reflecting the late afternoon sun. She remembered the rooftop where she once stood with a tray in her hand, unseen and underestimated. She remembered the moment silence fell after she spoke. That silence had not been emptiness. It had been recalibration. She no longer worked double shifts at the restaurant. She still passed it sometimes on her commute, the golden lights glowing above the city. But now she entered rooms through the front door, not the service hallway. Not because someone rescued her. Not because she demanded attention. But because she refused to shrink when confronted by assumption. Jonathan, in his office above the city, reviewed a message from the Tokyo team praising the tone of the new partnership framework. He set the tablet down and looked out over the skyline. Money could secure contracts. It could buy buildings and headlines. But it could not purchase credibility. That had to be earned, often in moments no one planned for. And somewhere between Queens and Midtown, between a rooftop insult and a signed agreement, two people discovered something the market would never fully measure. Power can fill a room, but dignity can change it.